In the winter of 1966, the small French village of Montcreaux was forced to confront something that violated every law of nature. A house that did not exist 3 days earlier now stood in the heart of the forest, occupied by a family that claimed they had lived there for 10 years. Within 48 hours, 3 villagers would be dead. The family would vanish without a trace, and the house itself would disappear as mysteriously as it arrived, leaving behind only questions that the authorities would spend decades trying to bury. Subscribe to the channel and join our community for more unexplained histories that shattered lives and changed everything. But let's go back to where it all began. The first person to discover the house was Marie Fontaine, a 63-year-old widow who walked the same forest path for 37 years. She collected mushrooms every Thursday morning, rain or shine, following a route so familiar that her feet could have found their way in complete darkness. On the morning of December 8, 1966, at approximately 7:45 a.m., Marie noticed something that stopped her in place. A thin column of smoke rising to the pine trees, maybe 200 meters ahead on a section of forest she knew with absolute certainty had been empty for decades. She approached cautiously. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else, something sweet but wrong. The trees seemed to part around a clearing she didn't remember, and there it was, a stone house, 2 stories, with a slate roof and smoke rising steadily from the chimney. It was not new. The stone was weathered, the door frame slightly warped, the windows filled with something that looked like years of dust. Yet Marie's mind refused to accept what her eyes reported. She had walked past this exact location last Thursday, the location before that. For decades, there had never been anything here but forest. Marie stood at the tree line for nearly 10 minutes, not moving, her mushroom basket hanging limp from her arm. She was a practical woman, a farmer's daughter, a widow who lived alone and solved her own problems. Hallucinations didn't fit her understanding of the world. She walked backward 7 steps, turned, and approached again. The house remained, solid, unmoved, real. The front door opened. A woman emerged, perhaps 45 years old, wearing a burgundy dress that looked as if it had been tailored sometime in the 1950s. She had dark hair pulled back into a bun, and her face possessed a kind of careful blankness that people cultivate when they've learned not to show fear or surprise. "Good morning," the woman said in French, though her accent was unclear. Not quite Parisian, not quite regional. "You're the first visitor we've had in a while. I am Solange Messier. This is my home." Marie opened her mouth and found she had no words prepared. Solange waited, her hands folded in front of her. I walk here every week." Marie finally managed. "There was no house here. I would have seen it." "There's always been a house here," Solange said simply. 10 years now. My husband and I and our daughter, we prefer privacy. Most people respect that." She paused, tilting her head slightly. "Did you need something?" Marie stumbled through an explanation about the mushrooms, the path, the absolute impossibility of not having noticed the house. Solange listened with a patience that bordered on indifference. When Marie finished, Solange smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "People see what they expect to see," Solange said. "Perhaps you weren't paying attention. It's easy to miss things when your mind is elsewhere." Marie left the forest that morning without any mushrooms. By noon, she had told the story to Père Luc, the village priest. By evening, it had reached the mayor, Lucien Rousseau, a man known for dismissing superstitions but taking land disputes seriously. By the following morning, Lucien had assembled 3 men, himself, Dr. Jacques Moreau, and Henri Dubois, who kept the general store, and they walked into the forest to investigate. The house was still there. This time, it was occupied by more than just Solange. A man answered the door, introducing himself as Edouard Mercier, Solange's husband. He was tall, perhaps 50, with gray threading through his dark hair and a manner of speaking that suggested education. University, possibly law. Behind him, Lucien caught a glimpse of a hallway and, at its far end, a girl, no more than 14, who immediately turned away and disappeared into shadow. "My wife mentioned a visitor yesterday," Edouard said, his tone hospitable but final. "We're grateful for the welcome, though, as I'm sure she explained, we value our seclusion." We have all we need here on our own land. We don't require anything from the village, and we trust the village has no requirements of us." Lucien explained about the records, about property taxes, about the fact that no house had been registered in the forestry maps. Edouard listened without interruption. "The records in Paris are imperfect." Edouard replied, "We've been here 10 years now. We have the deed, properly signed and registered. If there's been an administrative error, we're happy to clarify it with the appropriate authorities. But this is our home, and we're not troubling anyone. Surely that should be sufficient." He was right. Technically, the three men had no legal grounds to contest the family's presence. What troubled them wasn't the law. It was that every fiber of their local knowledge insisted this was impossible. Lucien had been born in Montcreaux. He had hunted in these forests as a boy. The house did not exist in any account of the land he possessed. Yet there it stood. The men returned to the village and reported their findings to an increasing crowd of curious residents. That evening, the story began to change. By the next morning, Marie's account had transformed into gossip about a family that appeared out of nowhere, speculation about whether they had bought land illegally, wonderings about why they were so secretive. Some suggested they were refugees from Algeria, running from the political upheaval. Others wondered if they were involved in some criminal enterprise. By the third day, curiosity had become suspicion, and suspicion, as it always does, began to ask dangerous questions. 3 days after the men visited the Mercier house, Henri Dubois didn't open his store. By afternoon, his nephew found him in the back room, slumped against the wall, eyes wide open and fixed on nothing. The doctor said it was a heart attack. Henri was 61, healthy by all accounts. But these things happen without warning. What shouldn't have happened was a note found in his pocket. A single line written in handwriting that wasn't his own, tell him to stop asking questions. Lucien Rousseau held the note in his office for 2 hours before deciding what to do with it. He could dismiss it as a prank, a coincidence, Henry's own writing mimicked by someone else. But he didn't believe in those kinds of coincidences. That night, Lucien walked to the forest alone. He found the house dark, except for a single window on the upper floor, where candlelight flickered behind thick curtains. He didn't approach the door. Instead, he stood at the tree line and watched until midnight, then left. The next morning, Père Luc was found in the church, hanging from the bell rope. The priest had been troubled, the villagers said, lonely, depressed by his declining health. Suicide wasn't uncommon among aging clergy. No one questioned it seriously until someone noticed the bruises on his wrists, the kind that come from restraint, not surrender, and there was no chair overturned beneath him. By the time Dr. Moreau died, found in his office with an empty bottle of sleeping pills beside him, though he'd never taken medication in his life. The village had stopped pretending these were accidents. Something was happening. Something was protecting the Mercier family. Lucien made a decision. He would go to the house with documentation, with authority, with the clear intention of demanding answers. He took 3 men with him. Marcel Arnaud, who managed a sawmill and had a reputation for not backing down. Claude Petit, the blacksmith, and Antoine Vibert, who kept the gendarmerie records and carried a pistol. They reached the house at dawn. Edouard answered the door as if he'd been expecting them. Behind him, the hallway stretched into darkness, and there was no sound from anywhere in the house. "I want answers," Lucien said. 3 men are dead. Your family appeared in impossible circumstances. You're going to explain what's happening here, or I'm bringing the authorities from the prefecture. Edouard stepped outside, closing the door carefully behind him. In daylight, his face looked older than it had before, and there was something in his expression, not guilt, not fear, but a kind of exhaustion, as if he'd been holding back something for a very long time and the effort was finally breaking him. "The house is real," Edouard said quietly. "We are real. But you're right, we don't belong here. Not in 1966. We arrived here because we had no choice. Because where we come from, there's no safety anymore. And your friends..." He paused. "Your friends died because they were trying to push us back into the darkness we came from. Some forces don't appreciate being questioned. What are you talking about?" Marcel stepped forward, his voice hard. Are you threatening us? No, Edouard said. I'm explaining why you should leave us alone. Go back to your village. Forget the house. Forget us. That's the only way anyone else survives. Lucien looked at the three men beside him, then back at Edouard. If you don't come with us to the prefecture— If I do, Edouard interrupted, you'll all be dead within the week, and your families after that. We didn't want this. We came here to disappear. But something followed us, and it will protect what's ours. That's not a threat. That's a warning. The men stood in the cold morning air, each understanding in that moment that they had crossed into territory where normal rules no longer applied. By evening, Lucien had sent a report to the prefecture requesting an investigation. By the next morning, he was dead, struck by a car that witnesses claimed seemed to swerve deliberately toward him as he crossed a village square. The driver was never found. The authorities arrived 3 days later. They found the house. They documented it. They attempted to take Edouard into custody. By that night, 2 gendarmes were hospitalized with unexplained seizures, and the inspector in charge had vanished from his hotel room on the 2nd floor. Found 3 kilometers away, wandering the forest with no memory of how he got there. By dawn, the prefecture abandoned the investigation. Official records would later describe the Mercier family as victims of a mass hysteria event, residents of a small village driven to violence by rural isolation and superstition. But the house was still there, and no one in Montcreaux went near it anymore. 3 weeks after the authorities withdrew, a young man named Thomas Girard made a decision that would unravel everything. He was 26, a schoolteacher, and he'd been in love with a blacksmith's daughter since childhood. Her name was Margot, and she'd recently ended their engagement under pressure from her family. Pressure that had intensified after the death began. Thomas believed the Mercier family was responsible. Everyone did. But he also believed that fear was a choice, and he wasn't willing to let fear dictate his life. So on a cold January evening, he walked to the house in the forest and knocked on the door. The girl answered. She was 14, with dark eyes that seemed far older than her face suggested, and she wore a simple gray dress that looked like it belonged to another decade. Her name was Isabelle. "I'm not supposed to talk to you," she said immediately, as if she'd been waiting for someone to try. "Then don't," Thomas replied. "Just listen. Whatever your family is, whatever's protecting this house, is destroying this village. People are dying. There has to be another way." Isabelle glanced behind her into the darkness of the hallway. When she turned back, there was something like desperation in her expression. "If I tell you the truth," she said quietly, "you'll wish you'd never come here, and you won't be able to leave it alone. Tell me anyway." She stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind her. In the moonlight, Thomas could see that her hands were shaking. "We're not from 1966, Isabelle began. "We're from 1976. From 10 years in the future. My father found a way, a place in time where the barriers are thin. We came back because in our time we're all dead. Our entire family line ends. We were supposed to hide here, live quietly, and create a different future. But something came with us. Something that shouldn't exist in this time at all. It's been feeding on the attention you're giving us, on the fear. Every death makes it stronger." Thomas listened, his mind struggling to accept what he was hearing. "Why should I believe you?" "Because you won't be able to stop yourself from believing," Isabelle said. "And because I'm going to tell you how to end this. But first, you need to understand, my mother didn't die of a heart attack. My father didn't flee in fear. They're trapped in the house. They've been trapped since the first person died. Something is controlling us all now. It wants to stay. It wants to feed." She described a mechanism in fragmented, desperate sentences. The house itself was a temporal anchor, a wound in time where past and future could bleed into each other. The family had been bait, intentionally or not. Now the wound was widening, and something was using it as a doorway. "To close it," Isabelle whispered. "Someone has to go inside," and she stopped abruptly, her eyes widening. It knows I'm telling you." The temperature dropped so suddenly that Thomas could see his breath. Behind Isabelle, the house began to darken, not gradually but all at once, as if light itself was being pulled inward. Isabel screamed, a sound that contained pure animal terror, and the door behind her opened violently, pulling her backward into the black. Thomas ran. He ran to the forest without direction, branches tearing at his face, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't stop running until he reached the village and collapsed at the steps of the church. By morning, he was hospitalized with severe hypothermia and frostbite, despite the temperature having been only slightly below freezing. He survived, but he never spoke coherently about what he'd seen. The doctors labeled it psychological trauma and left it at that. But Thomas had heard enough. Over the next 2 days, he managed to communicate fragments of information to Margot, who passed it to her father, who told Lucien's replacement as mayor, a cautious man named Gerard Fontaine. The information was impossible, irrational, and completely consistent with the pattern of events. By the third day, Gerard had made contact with priest in Lyon, who studied unusual phenomena, a man named Father Devereaux, who had spent 20 years investigating cases that the church preferred to keep quiet. Father Devereaux listened to the account and made a single statement. If what you're describing is accurate, the house must be destroyed. Not sealed. Destroyed completely. And everyone inside must be removed before that happens. On January 19th, 1966, 6 men approached the house with gasoline and torches. What happened next would be disputed for decades. Some witnesses claimed the house simply caught fire. Others swore the flames came from inside. Still others insisted they saw figures moving to the smoke that didn't move like human beings at all. The house burned for 3 hours. When it was over, nothing remained but blackened stone and ash. No bodies were found. No evidence of the Mercier family, alive or dead. And Margot was gone. She'd walked into the forest that night and never returned. 43 years later, in 2009, a researcher named Dr. Christian Mercier was cataloging files in the basement archives of the Lyon Diocese when she found a sealed envelope marked with a single date, January 19th, 1966. Inside were photographs of the house, witness statements, and a handwritten account by Father Devereaux describing the events in Montcreaux in clinical, precise language. Christian was a historian specializing in rural folklore and unexplained events. She was also Isabel Mercier's granddaughter, though she'd never known her grandmother. Her father had been born in the future timeline, adopted and raised by a family in Belgium, with no knowledge of his true origins until a deathbed confession weeks before Christian was born. She read the account 3 times. Then she drove to Montcreaux. The village had changed little in 4 decades. The forest remained. The clearing where the house had stood was now overgrown, indistinguishable from the surrounding woodland. Christian spoke to the few elderly residents who remembered 1966. Their stories were consistent. A house that appeared, a family that wasn't supposed to exist, deaths that followed inquiry. One woman, Marie's daughter, told her something that made Christian's breath catch. "My mother never recovered from that winter," the woman said. She kept insisting that the house was still there, that we just couldn't see it. Days before she died, she tried to walk into the forest. We found her standing in the exact spot where the house had been, staring at nothing, speaking to people who weren't there. That night, Christian entered the forest alone. She found the clearing without difficulty. Not because it was marked, but because the trees seemed to part for her, as if they recognized something in her bloodline. She didn't see the house at first. She stood in the empty space for nearly an hour, her eyes adjusting, her mind beginning to understand what her perception was refusing to acknowledge. And then, gradually, the shapes began to resolve. Stone, a doorframe, windows, smoke from the chimney. The house had never burned. It had only stopped being visible. The door opened. Edouard stood in the threshold, exactly as he had appeared in 1966, unchanged, undecayed, existing in a state that violated every law of time and biology. "You're Isabel's granddaughter," he said. It wasn't a question. She said you would come eventually, that you'd find the files and piece together the truth. She wanted you to know what happened. Christian's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Where is she? Where's my grandmother?" Inside, Edouard said, "Waiting. We've all been waiting, ever since we came through. Time moves differently here. For us, It's still 1966. We're still waiting for you to understand what we did and why. Christiane stepped forward. Behind her, the forest seemed to contract, the trees closing in, the sound of the world outside fading to nothing. As she crossed the threshold, she understood that she would never truly leave this place. Some doors, once opened, remain open whether you wish them to or not. Inside the house, Isabel was sitting at a table, writing. She was 14 years old, and her eyes held the weight of someone who had lived 1,000 years. She looked up and smiled, not a smile of joy, but of recognition. The smile of someone finally seeing a family member after an impossibly long separation. "Thank you for coming," Isabel said. "We need to tell you what we built here, and why we need you to help us expand it." Behind Christiane, Edouard closed the door. Outside, the forest settled into silence once more. Christiane spent 3 days inside the house, or what felt like 3 days. Time became unreliable, elastic, bending around the structure like water around a stone. When she emerged, 2 weeks had passed in the outside world. She was changed, not physically. Her body remained intact, but something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of reality. She understood now what the house was, what it had always been, a seed, a temporal seed planted by Edouard and Solange decades ago, waiting for the right person to water it with knowledge, consent, and blood. Christiane returned to Lyon and quietly began her work. She used her position in the diocese archives to access files from across France, records of disappearances, unexplained deaths, temporal anomalies that the church had carefully documented and deliberately hidden. She cross-referenced them with census data, police reports, family genealogies. The pattern emerged slowly at first, then with terrifying clarity. The house in Montcreaux wasn't unique. There were others. A chateau in Normandy where an entire aristocratic family vanished in 1887, leaving behind only a journal describing guests from tomorrow. A monastery in Burgundy where 17 monks died of sudden aging in 1952, their bodies decomposing decades in a matter of hours. A farmhouse in Provence where a woman gave birth to quintuplets in 1978, all of them identical, all of them born at the same age. They were all doorways, all of them thinning the barrier between timelines, creating spaces where the normal rules of causality and temporality no longer applied. By 2015, Christiane had mapped 23 confirmed sites. She had also begun to understand her family's role. Edouard and Solange hadn't fled to 1966 to hide. They had come to anchor themselves, to create a foothold in a past timeline that would allow them to build a network of these houses, these wounds in reality. And they needed descendants, people with inherited temporal sensitivity, to expand the network. Margot hadn't disappeared in 1966. She had walked into the forest and become the second house, the second seed. Thomas Girard's daughter, born 9 months after that night, had inherited her father's sensitivity and her mother's connection to the temporal barrier. She had become the third. And Christiane herself, the granddaughter of Isabel and an unknown man she'd never met, a man who existed in no official records, was the pivot point, the one who would bring everything together. In October 2015, Christiane published a historical monograph titled Temporal Anomalies in Rural France. Folklore or fact? It was academically rigorous, carefully sourced, deliberately published through a small press that ensured limited distribution. 37 copies were printed. 23 went to specific individuals, each one living near one of the identified sites, each one a descendant of someone touched by the network, each one a potential doorway. The remaining 14 copies were archived in the Lyon Diocese and scattered across Europe. Within 6 months, 8 new houses had appeared. By 2017, there were 40. By 2020, over 100, each one invisible to ordinary perception, each one housing a family that didn't age, didn't die, didn't exist in any official capacity. The authorities never caught on. How could they? The houses existed in the spaces between timelines, perceivable only to those with a genetic or spiritual sensitivity to see them. Urban planners didn't trip over them. Hikers didn't stumble upon them. They were perfectly hidden because they existed in a state of quantum uncertainty. present and absent simultaneously, real only to those who have been marked by proximity to the network. Christiane disappeared in 2021. Her last email, sent to the Lyon Diocese, contained a single sentence: "The expansion is complete. The next phase begins with the children." What no one outside the network understood was that the houses weren't destinations. They were propagation vectors. Everyone who entered one carried something back out with them. Not a virus, but an awareness, a connection, a subtle alteration in their perception of reality that made them susceptible to the network's pull. And the children born to people who'd been inside the houses, they were something else entirely. They could see between timelines naturally. For them, the barrier was transparent. They didn't need houses to move between moments. They were becoming something new, something that existed partially in 1966, partially in 2025, partially in futures that hadn't yet occurred. Marie Fontaine's great-great-grandson developed the ability at age 7. Edouard's original assistant, a man who'd entered the house once out of curiosity in 1966, had a daughter who could manipulate temporal flow, making seconds stretch into hours, compressing days into moments. That daughter had 6 children. All of them carried the gift. By 2025, there were over 3,000 documented cases of temporal sensitivity in populations across France, Germany, and Eastern Europe. The numbers were accelerating. Within a generation, perhaps 2, the barrier between timelines would be so thoroughly compromised that the distinction between past, present, and future would cease to have meaning. The authorities had no framework for understanding what was happening. The scientific community dismissed it as pseudoscience and mass psychology. The church, which knew the truth, remained silent, bound by centuries of protocols designed to contain exactly this kind of existential threat. But in the forest of Montcreaux, in a clearing that existed and didn't exist, Edouard and Solange sat at a table with their daughter, their great-grandchildren, and the growing number of people who had voluntarily entered the network. They were playing a game of chess that had been ongoing for 59 years, a game that existed across multiple timelines simultaneously, and they were winning. Outside the houses, the world continued its ordinary rotation, unaware that its temporal structure was slowly unraveling. People lived their lives, made their plans, believed in causality and consequence. They didn't yet understand that free will was about to become a much more complicated proposition. But the children were beginning to sense it. In quiet moments, they felt the timelines pressing against each other like walls of water held back by progressively weakening dams. They heard voices from futures they hadn't yet lived. They remembered events that hadn't occurred yet. They understood, in the way that children understand things that adults have learned to ignore, that reality itself was about to be fundamentally restructured. And somewhere in the space between moments, in houses that could be anywhere and nowhere, Isabel Mercier was writing in a journal, documenting every detailed expansion, waiting for the moment when the network would reach critical mass. When it did, everything would change. The past would become negotiable, the future would become malleable, and the present, that thin, precarious moment where most of humanity had always believed they lived, will become just another timeline, just another choice, just another door among countless others. The house that appeared in 1966 had never really disappeared. It had simply learned to multiply.